Growing up in the Kootenays, his interest in wildlife was sparked at an early age. As a field biologist, he has and continues to contribute to a variety of projects in both BC and Alberta that range from biodiversity, species at risk, breeding bird, and fall migration surveys and monitoring. When not in the field, Sachi spends his winters working at a wildlife genetics laboratory. He's a big proponent of citizen science and public engagement as tools to broaden public awareness to help fuel conservation. And I'll let you do it.
Am I loud enough? Can everyone hear me?
I prefer if you use the mic.
Do you want to use the mic? Okay, great.
It would be good if you move the stand.
We'll just move the stand backwards a little bit.
You okay now?
Further over.
This way? Yeah, tell me when we're good.
You've got 4 feet, 3 feet.
How's that?
More yet, 2 feet.
Does
Keep going. Okay,
well,
you're pretty good.
that work?
Actually, you could move to the
Yeah, you can see well?
That's good, thank you.
Yeah? And you can hear me well?
Yes.
All right. If I tend to stray a little bit when I start talking, so if I move away from this, someone just kind of point at me and let me know. So, were any of you guys were at the Bird Fest, but you weren't at the presentation, hey? So this is new at least? Okay,
Yeah.
that's good. So, I'm Sachi, and I'm honored to have been asked to give you guys this presentation. Thank you. And yeah, I would also like to recognize that, I mean, it gets a bit messy on whose territory we're gathering on. I guess it's a mix between the Okanagan, the Sinaiaks, and the Tanaha. Yeah. But where I work, so in the Chilcotin, it's a little clearer. There's several groups that make up the Tsilhqot'in Nation, and in fact, the mountain range behind what we're looking at here is part of their tidal lands. So the valley that I work in is right up against the lines that were drawn for their tidal case that they won. I think it was back in 2014. So I'm going to talk about migration monitoring. I don't know if any of you have been involved in migration monitoring or know much about it. I'm going to use the place that I work at the Tapioca Lake Bird Observatory as kind of a model on the system, and that's replicated across the country. There are about 30 different bird observatories that are part of a member organization I'll talk about. So I'm going to start kind of large at long-term monitoring projects and then hone in on migration monitoring, and just take a really, really small sidetrack into avian molt, because that's a whole nother beast. And just kind of give you a little idea of one of the major tools we use to age birds in the hand. So migration monitoring, it's a global thing. There are places all over the globe where people are capturing birds and monitoring populations. I have a friend who actually plans her vacations based on where she can go volunteer at a bird observatory. So she's been to Azerbaijan, Mongolia, Greece. I think recently she went to Thailand. So she has some pretty wild adventures. Mongolia was definitely a very wild one. Mostly chasing cattle and trying to get them out of the nets. I also had friends who banned, they call it ringing in Europe, where they have stations that have been running for a long, long time. Places like Denmark or Scandinavia, of course the UK is a big one. And so in North America, the longest running bird observatory is the Long Point Bird Observatory, which was established, as you can see, in 1959. It's been running continuously ever since. It's on a big spit of sand that goes out into Lake Erie. I'll show you a picture of the location. And on that point, there are 3 different stations that they run where they capture birds and they monitor birds. So with migration monitoring, because one of the main tools is capturing birds in mist nets, you need to use geography to your advantage because your nets don't move. They stay in the same place every year. So you have to use features like peninsulas. This is easier out east with the Great Lakes because you have these natural choke and funnel points where birds will move through. You can find staging sites or stopover sites, but in the west it's a lot more challenging. Part of it, I think, is a throwback to glaciation. Birds in the west seem to just kind of move north-south for the most part. The boreal breeders tend to go across to the east, and they spread out, but you've probably noticed in the Kootenays, like you don't see the same concentration that you see during migration out in Ontario or even in the prairies for certain species. It's a little more spread out, so it's a little trickier. And generally, these operations are group specific. So we're focusing on capturing mostly passerines. We catch a few raptors, but our station especially does not work on waterfowl or shorebirds. There's some visual monitoring, but we don't work on banding them. The other interesting thing is that these bird observatories across Canada were all created by individuals. So there wasn't like an overarching theme of, okay, how can we look at Canada and get a cohesive monitoring program. So, Long Point was created, and then they created Birds Canada to manage Long Point, and then they also created Thunder Cape. So there was some intelligent design there, but otherwise they're just spread across the map. And so over time, Birds Canada has created the CMMN, which is the Canadian Migration Monitoring Network. And the goal of that organization is to take all of these bird observatories under one umbrella, start to create a really consistent protocol so that the data is comparable, and you can start to look at, you can take all the data from each of these small points and look at the broader picture of how species are doing, because it's hard to infer, it's tricky to infer much from one bird observatory because you don't necessarily know where all your birds are breeding. You can get ideas of numbers, but some years, there's better food in one portion of your monitoring area, so the birds are feeding over there, and you don't capture as many. Other years you capture more, so there's a lot of variables, like anything in ecology or biology. Trying to tease out the data from the useful data from the noise is always a challenge. And then all of this information feeds into Nature Counts, which is housed by the CMMN, and it's a free online resource. And then all the banding data goes to the Bird Banding Observatory. So all of the measurements, all of the identification, all of that goes to Environment Canada, and then it's passed on to a central database that's housed by the USGS, who also incidentally issues all of the bands North America wide. So everything comes out of USGS in the States and then gets dispersed.
USGS is Geological Survey.
Yeah, the US Geological
And they
Survey.
issue the bands.
Yeah, they do a lot of wildlife work, which is a bit of a misnomer. It's a little confusing. I mean, all the breeding bird surveys, that's all USGS. So there's Long Point. You can see on Lake Erie. There was a thought, and I don't know if this has been investigated, but that it is slowly moving. So the tip is eroding, and it's kind of being moved south because of the way it's not tides in the Great Lakes. I think it's called the sesh. So it's like depositing on one side and taking away on the other side. But that's slow. And there's an invasive called the Phragmites, which they're eradicating, but there's also a thought that that's what's holding the tip together, like holding the point together, because there's so much of it, because otherwise it's mostly sand.
It's a rush, right?
Yeah, it goes really, really densely, yeah. It's a neat place if you've never been there. Access beyond where the park ends is quite challenging. It's all boat access, but it's a fabulous place. I spent a couple months there many years ago. So there's Northern Harrier. We do capture them. It's the biggest bird that we capture, and they're, like you said, they're beautiful, right? They're really fun to watch. So here's some components, this is what every bird observatory has that's a part of the CMMN. Mist netting is kind of the main piece of the puzzle, and then on top of that we have standardized protocols of when we operate, how long we operate. The nets always have to be in the same place, and then we do a daily census, which is basically a consistent route that you walk that's timed, and you identify all the birds along that route. Daily observations that are incidental, and then that all comes into this one tally, and I'll talk about that later, and that's the data that we submit. It gives you a snapshot of what was detected during that 6.5 hour monitoring period. There's other aspects that some observatories work in, like migration watch. So there's places in Alberta where they don't capture much, but there's a lot of movement. So they actually spend a lot of time just counting and identifying the birds flying over. And then there's hawk watches as well, depending on your location. We tried to create a hawk watch, but there's just not enough volume. And the site was pretty tricky to access, so it was a bit of a trek. And every time we went, it was fun, but not enough movement in the valley itself. And then, of course, with these kind of projects, funding is always an issue. It seems like more and more funding surveys is more challenging, and almost all of the observatories are run by nonprofits. So you can imagine every year as a battle just to get enough. And even though it's a bare bones operation, you're basically paying for wages. It's still tricky. So here's kind of an overview of other long-term projects. Hawk watches. There's a place in Chelan Ridge in Washington State where they have teams go out and they monitor the raptor migration and they capture a few. There's also winter banding and research programs, mainly in the prairies and in Ontario. And most of that's trying to study raptor molt, which is quite challenging because it's quite protracted. There's some species that take 6 weeks or 6 months even, I think Swainson's hawk, that actually are molting throughout their breeding season and their migration. So as I'll talk about later, comparing the age of the feathers becomes really challenging because the feathers are quite a bit molted out at a different time. There's owl monitoring. Almost every station now performs a northern saw-whet owl monitoring program, which I'll talk about. Monitoring avian productivity and survivorship. MAPS is a program that I've worked on that's out of IBP, and I'll talk more about these ones. Acoustic monitoring is becoming a big deal. Environment Canada and Birds Canada are using it now for marsh monitoring, especially in the prairies and in Ontario, because you can just put out an autonomous recording unit and then you can pay people to transcribe all of those recordings. I think in a lot of ways, you can cover more ground. The boreal forest as well, they're doing a lot of that kind of monitoring. There's some trials now using them for screech owls on the coast, which is tricky because the microphones differ and screech owls are kind of hard to detect at the best of times. On the coasts, a lot of these observatories do a sea watch, and then of course a lot of you have participated in Christmas bird counts and breeding bird surveys. So those are all kind of long-term projects. MAPS is a really cool project. I worked on it up in Fort McMurray a couple summers ago. It's out of the Institute for Bird Populations, which is headed out of California, and it's like migration monitoring, that you're capturing birds but on their breeding grounds. So the focus is trying to understand recruitment and productivity. And you go out to multiple sites and you set up and you spend a day every 10 days. And you're looking at, the real goal is using molt, which I'll get into later, to differentiate birds that are passerines that are in their first breeding season versus ones that have already bred before, because the ones that have bred before tend to take the better territories. And then the first year birds, the first year breeders, get the kind of pushed out to the sides. And so you can start to really measure habitat quality. And then look at survivalship. You capture young, you can see whether they make it past to fledging, and then you can start to see whether birds return to their breeding sites, which is also really interesting. This one was focused around the tar sands, which is, it's a rough place if you care about the environment, but as soon as you get out into the boreal forest, the untouched boreal forest, it's pretty fabulous. And then there's also a counterpart in the southern hemisphere called MOSI, which is monitoring winter survival. And so this kind of partnership is one of the few ways that we can get a bigger picture on what's happening with populations. Because we're so focused on where we live, there's often challenges in their wintering grounds. I think Canada warbler was one species where these two projects teamed up, and we were having a lot of challenges with Canada warblers. Their populations seemed to be declining in the boreal forest. Few were returning, and through MOSI they found out that there were actually indeed some challenges with deforestation and loss of overwintering habitat. I had to show a picture of an owl. I think, it's very unprofessional to say, but saw-whets are amazing. They're also very cute. It's not really the right term. This one is in its juvenile plumage, so it hasn't undergone its first major molt into adult plumage. So it's not long out of the nest. You can kind of see the sort of almost the appearance of a hood and the sort of not quite buffy but yellowish sides. This is something that almost all bird observatories, including the one I work at, engage in the fall when they're moving. The migration, people say migration of saw-whets. I don't know. I don't know what the definition is. It's hard to say whether it's migration, dispersal. There's some theories that the dominant males actually stay on territory so that they can keep it for the next year, and then everyone else moves on. I'll talk about some other work we did on saw-whets that was trying to understand where do they go. They seem like they're more like finches or crossbills, and they follow food. That's kind of the more important part because they're quite hardy. Because some of the tracking work we did, basically saw-whets went like this from one location. It wasn't a clear route. Yeah.
What is their main food?
They like to eat rodents. Rodents.
Rodents.
Yeah, so their population's actually tied to the rodent population, which peaks every 4 years, so does the saw-whet population. And so those are the exciting years when you're actually working with them because you catch quite a few. So this is the place that I've spent probably over half a decade now. Every fall I go up there. It's about 13 hours away. And it's in a rather remote part of the province. There still isn't, as soon as you leave Williams Lake, I'll show you an image, you lose cell service and there's no grocery store. There's maybe 3 gas stations on the way. And it's a beautiful place. It's a beautiful part of the province. If you've never been, I would definitely encourage you to go. It was founded by the NCC. When they moved out of Ontario, they bought up a whole bunch of land in this valley, in the Tatlico Valley. And it was Andrew Hardcombe. Yeah, the Nature Conservancy of Canada. Yeah, Andrew Hardcombe was working for them. He's a retired government biologist. I think it was the Conservation Data Center that he ran for a long time. And he had worked at Rocky Point, and so he brought in the bird observatory as a biodiversity effectiveness monitoring tool. And the thought was, and I'll show you, that you can see the Tatlioko Lake Bird Observatory. And then this is Tatlioko Lake, and then the Hamathko continues and goes all the way out to Butte Inlet. So it's quite unique. There's not a lot of lakes that drain all the way out, kind of a roughly north-south. And so the thought was maybe this is a migratory corridor. Maybe birds move through this valley system every year each way. And I think we're pretty certain that's not the case. I'll talk about that. It's more of a migratory track than fall migration. So the TLBO has been running since 2006, except for 2016 when it moved from NCC to another organization and funding fell through. There's been some attempts at spring banding, which has shown that you just capture breeders. No one's moving up that valley. It's pretty rugged when you go up towards the coast. It's a really low volume station, so 26,000 birds banded in 16 seasons. I mean, Long Point can easily do that in a season. So, a big year for us is 2,058 days. Last year was really low, and we banded less than 1,000. So it's not a lot. So hence the migratory trap. But our visual detections is a big part of the picture too. So we've detected over 330,000 birds in that time. So we do see a lot of movement, relatively, and we've banded. It's getting close to 500 saw-whets. And now, finally, after quite a few uncertain years, the observatory is under a new nonprofit that is centered in the valley, that is the Tatlioko Lake Field Station Society, and they're focused on trying to promote research in the region, because it's quite a unique region. The Chilcotin Plateau, if I go back, is a high grass prairie, and then you run into this, you hit the Coast Range Mountains, and it turns into this dry valley, interior valley, and then you go all the way out to the coast into a coastal rainforest. So it's kind of an interesting transition zone. So what is fall monitoring? Everyone, you probably hear mist nets and walking around pulling birds out of nets. What does that look like? This is an overview of the net loop. So this is the banding hut where we work, that little house-looking icon. And then the numbers and lines are different net locations. It's about a kilometer loop, which is quite large. Most bird observatories are quite small, but we're trying to sample a wide variety of habitat. We only operate 58 days for banding. That's if every day is good weather. We have 3 raptor nets, so we target northern harriers. We have a net set up to capture them because they come through. We get quite a few. We don't capture very many. We capture about 1 a year. And then we do set up some other non-standard nets depending on the season. And then our saw-whet owl program starts in the first week of September and now runs to mid-October. So we've extended it. So that's a look into kind of a day in the life. We have a couple visitors and then a couple locals who are visiting as well. And that's myself, and then the white-hatted person was my counterpart last year and will be my counterpart again, and her name is also Sachi, which is bizarre. I don't know what the chances are. So the way we operate is we open nets at local sunrise. That changes by about 5 minutes every 3 to 5 days. We then check them every 30 minutes, and that's all focused on bird safety. They're closed after 6 hours. And the census that I talked about before runs at about 1.5 hours after local sunrise, which is thought to be peak bird activity. And then we collect sightings throughout the day. So every bird, we record every bird we saw and heard, which is a bit of an undertaking. And then that all goes into the snapshot at the end. And we do a daily blog posting, which most observatories do weekly. Daily is a lot, especially when you've been out all morning. But it's fun and we make it educational, and we mostly put up a lot of pictures, which I think people really enjoy.
Sachi, when you say nets open and close, what do you actually do?
Yeah.
What do you do with
Good question. I'll explain that right
Okay.
now. You're reading my mind. That's perfect. So that's a net. You can probably barely see it. They're called mist nets for a reason. The idea is you cannot see them, and hopefully the birds can't either. So that's kind of inserted into a piece of riparian habitat right along the edge of the river. There's alder and willow scrub on either side, so as they're passing through feeding, they go through this opening and into the net. So it's a 3-panel net. It's 3 meters tall, 12 meters long, and what we do at the end of the day is we collapse these panels into each other, and then we can furl them, which is like a rolling, where you flick them into the top panel and it just turns into this nice line. So nothing can get caught in it. Because, heaven forbid you leave it open. Yeah. The other thing that I should mention is passive capture, but a lot of people get uncomfortable with nets, which I think is understandable. Every time you handle wildlife, you really have to think about ethics, and you have to think about how important is this data. Is it important enough to inconvenience these birds minimally? And every decision we make is based on bird safety. So weather is a huge one. If the weather isn't suitable, we do not open the nets. If birds are being adversely affected, then the data is not that important. And then further, we all have actual permits from Environment Canada. So we undergo quite a rigorous process to get those permits, and we are required to report everything. So it's fairly regulated, which is good. So the other question is, again, you want to go out and capture some birds and hold them in your hand and look at them closely, but what are you actually getting from these birds in the hand that you would not be able to get otherwise? You're getting a species identification. You can do that in the field, except for some really tricky species. You almost never, I've never had an experience where there's a bird in your hand that you can't identify. Now, some you have to take a suite of measurements. Impedinax flycatchers, when they're silent, can be interesting, especially because we get willow and alder. So that's a suite of 7 measurements, morphometric measurements to differentiate them, and even then, sometimes you still have to call it the trails. Age, you can also, in fall, depending on the species, some species the plumages are different, but most of them you're getting an age that you wouldn't otherwise get. So you can start to figure out these age-sex ratios every year, which could infer breeding success. And then you can get all these other things like mass, wing length, breeding condition, which is helpful if they're late breeders, and then fat deposition, which is also really interesting. So birds, you blow the feathers and look at their body, and normally, if the bird isn't migrating, it's basically just like lean muscle. It's all pink. And then as they're getting to migrate, they deposit fat in the hollow here, and then they start to deposit on their sides, and then they'll run. And so a bird that's ready to go, like a Swainson's thrush that's making a long journey, you can't see any pink. It's just these lumps and mounds of fat that they're going to use on their journey. So we've learned that kind of the timing of migration through banding and monitoring projects. We know that, so hatch years, so males born that year are the first to migrate, then the females born that year, then the adult males, and then the adult females. The reason the adults go later is that they undergo a much more extensive molt. They replace every feather on their body. The birds born that year, they've already undergone a kind of, it's called a partial molt, so they replace all their body plumage and they leave their flight feathers for the first year. And that's how I'll talk about this later, but that's how we can differentiate between the second years, the birds that are in their first breeding year, and the ones that are older than that. And then we also catch birds in our nets that otherwise we would never detect. So there's not many veeries in the valley. We almost never detect them by sight or sound. We never see them, you never hear them, yet we capture 2 or 3 a year. So they're pretty skulky. And then other really cool things like gray-cheeked thrush, which breeds sparsely to the north, but we've never seen them. Brewer's sparrow, rose-breasted grosbeak. So there's a lot of species that you can add to your detection list through mist netting. But the most important thing is this next one. So recaptures is probably the most important piece of data that we get, which infers and can tell you about site fidelity, so whether this bird returns to the same place every year, and longevity, because with molt we can only age them to a certain point, and then beyond that we have no idea. Interstation recaptures are also the other really important thing, but because BC only has 5 bird observatories and they're totally spread out, there's little to none. But saw-whets are the one exception, and I'll talk about that. So, interannual recaptures. So that's, again, for us, the most exciting thing. Birds that we band at some point, whether we band them their first year of life or whether we band them as an adult, and then we catch them, sporadically or year after year. And so you start to get an idea of how long species can actually live for in the wild. And then it actually shows you that this bird comes back here, like the song sparrow, every year we catch her and she's in breeding condition. So we know that she's breeding on the property or somewhere within the vicinity. We cannot age passerines of these songbirds beyond after second year. So once we can say they're a second year, and then after that we don't know. So we know they're at least 3 is kind of the oldest. There's some special cases, and those are to do with raptors and woodpeckers. They undergo a much more complex molt, and they retain more than 2 generations of feathers. So at that point, you can start to get a little more detailed. So here's just kind of this is the list actually from last year of all our interannual recaptures. So that top one is the most interesting because we banded that bird in 2012, Swainson's thrush, and we recaptured it sporadically over the years, and we captured it this year, which means that the bird is 10 years old. So that bird has in all likelihood gone from the Tatlaco Valley or further north down to the Amazon basin and back over those 10 years. It's made the journey. So, I mean, that's pretty impressive considering all of the things that those birds have to contend with on their journey. So that's interesting. The oldest Swainson's on record is about 12 to 13 years old. So it gives you an idea of how long these birds are active. Rocky Point Bird Observatory is located on the southern tip of Vancouver Island and is right here. And we're up here. There's also one, Iona, which is down by the airport, and then Vasso's in the interior over here. Mackenzie's up north. In all the years, the only place that's ever captured any of our birds is Rocky Point. They've captured 9 of our saw-whets in 10 years. And generally what happens, not always, but generally what happens is I'll band a bird, and 10 days later I'll get a text message from one of the owl banders down there, and she'll send me a string of numbers, which is the band number, and it turns out it's one of our birds. So that's really cool. So they do seem to, some of them do seem to go down that way. Obviously, this is a bias because there aren't other bird observatories kind of in other directions necessarily. The other ones are incidentals. So this one was actually a recovered pellet or a recovered band in a great horned owl pellet. So the bird was eaten. There's a couple injuries. The one on Bainbridge Island, down the bottom one below Rocky Point in the States, that's a banding operation that recaptured one of our owls. And then the other ones were, they hit a car and were taken to a rehab facility. So that's really interesting. But otherwise, we've had a couple of our song sparrows, someone finds the band, reports it, and they were window strikes in Washington, which is always really sad because they were both born that year, so they didn't make it very far. And then a Wilson's warbler that was also injured but taken to a rehab facility and released and have improved down in California. So you can imagine 26,000 birds banded and that's it. So we're sampling a different population. And it says the same for all of the 5 bird observatories because there is little to no connectivity as far as foreign recaptures. So just a quick overview of what the banding, what does this look like? You capture a bird in a net, you carefully take it out, you put it in a bird bag. I'll show you a picture in a moment. Each bird goes in its own bag. It's a nice quiet place for them. And then they're processed. So we affix a band to this bird's leg. It has a unique 9-digit number. So there's a prefix that's 4 digits and a suffix that's 5. And so that combination is unique in all of North America. There's no other band with that number. So if that bird is caught by anyone or found, you can report it, and then that's attached to all of the information that we glean from that bird. It goes into a record. And that band generally stays on for life. There's different size bands for different species, different alloys. The raptors get a pretty tough band that has a lock on because they try to get them off. Yeah, the songbird ones are so small that it feels a little crazy to affix them. Not as crazy as hummingbird bands. So it's definitely a process that takes a lot of skill to actually do it effectively and efficiently. So here's Sachi on the left. There's the birds hanging in the bags. And on the right, she's processing a red-eyed vireo. You can see these are specialized banding pliers right here. They have a little pin where in North America you have to open the band first. In Europe, you don't. They come opened and then you just put them on. Of course, North America has to be different than Europe. I would prefer if I just got to put them on. Opening them is part of the challenge. And then we have those rulers are for measuring wings because you can put the one part here and then measure the wing chord. And then the black, strange-looking piece of metal is leg gauge, so you can figure out what size band if you don't already know. And then this was the most exciting bird of last year. This is a female hatch year, so born that year, rose-breasted grosbeak. And you can see the band on the leg. So that's what it looks like. And it moves around freely, but not too freely. So we also have some protocols around what birds we can count. So the yellow line is our census area. So any bird that's outside that area, we don't count. It's 125 acres, so you can imagine 2 people can't really cover that. The black box denotes the net loop that I showed you earlier. And then the census route is that green that goes all the way down to the lake. So the census actually, what it does is we spend all our time kind of in that black box. Census gives you a better idea of the broader area, so birds we wouldn't otherwise see, like down the lake or down that lagoon. So that's the lagoon, that's near the head of the lake. Census is like a 1-hour, basically it's an encounter survey, so a transect that you walk. It's timed, so you think you have a magnolia warbler, you can't spend forever trying to see it, you gotta keep moving. It is the most comparable, repeatable thing that is done at every bird observatory because it happens rain or shine. Banding does not. It could be snowing, you still have to go, and it's 1.5 hours after local sunrise, which changes every day. Daily observations, incidentals. You see a Lincoln sparrow, you make a mark and add it to the rest. And it continues throughout the entire day, so you're kind of multitasking, which is fun. So if there's not a lot of birds to band, then you just bird, which is really fun. Go somewhere where we haven't been, try to cover the entire area. Daily estimated totals is that final snapshot where you take these three things, the banding totals, the census data, and the daily observations, and it all goes into one snapshot for the day. I'll show you just a little example. And then that goes, each day's final tally goes into the CMMN, and then they can take all that information and try to infer broader population numbers off of it. So it's just an Excel spreadsheet. You can see September 8th, 18th. The first column is the new birds banded, then the recaptures, and then our observations, census, and then that final tally, which is when you get into, it's a challenge to be super scientific because you have two people counting and you have multiple columns and you don't always know if the yellow-rumped warbler that flew overhead then flew in your net. So it's a bit of a haggling process, so it's a best guess. Like anything, you're estimating. So other projects. So bird observatories, they present a really good opportunity for researchers because they're already operating and handling birds. So other projects can use staff, namely myself, to do other data collection. MODIS, I don't know if any of you are familiar with MODIS. It's kind of a new tracking, well, new, it's the latest wildlife tracking system. It's basically telemetry, but automated telemetry. I'll show you a picture of the tags. They're quite small. And it requires the bird to fly within range, which is about 15 to 20 kilometers, given good sight lines, of a receiving tower, which is what you're looking at. These two elements on either side of the solar panels, those are the receiving elements. So when a bird flies within 15 to 20 kilometers of those elements, we get a ping. And so each tag emits a specific burst pattern at a specific VHF frequency. I forget what MODIS stands for. I think it stands for movement in Latin. And it was actually created out of, there's a prof out of Atlantic Canada, I think in Nova Scotia, and then a couple in Ontario, so it's a Canadian thing, which is really exciting. It's taking off worldwide. You can, I think they have tags now you can put on monarchs. They're quite small.
Wow.
It's pretty wild. It's like a little sticker, which kind of seems crazy. And then we also work on for feather sampling for different projects. So right now, actually last year, we worked on a feather sampling project done by Birds Canada and Environment Canada, and it's looking at boreal breeders and aerial insectivores. So two groups that, well, those the boreal breeders are having challenges due to a lot of mineral exploration. You have all the mining for oil, and you have a lot of seismic, and then the aerial insectivores, of course, everyone knows are one of the groups that are doing really poorly. So we're taking tail feather samples, and from that they can do isotope analysis to look at contaminants and try to get an idea of what they're feeding on, etc. So it's pretty handy because all the bird observatories across Canada are part of this. So if you have a species on their list, you can sample that species. We've done some blood sampling in conjunction with feather sampling for molt migration project. So there's a theory that some birds will breed in one place and then they'll migrate a little ways away and then start to molt. Whereas a lot of species will just molt right on their breeding site. And this is kind of thought to avoid predators, plus to find a new food source if they've already kind of depleted that food source. And then this final one was louse flies. So they're a parasitic fly that suck blood from birds. They're kind of under the feathers. And so we were taking these flies and sending them to a researcher who was undergoing their master's project to try to identify these flies. And it turns out, I think you could identify the fly based on which group it was feeding on. So the thrushes all have one, the warblers have another. So it was kind of interesting. Well, yeah, I'm familiar with that. I remembered something. So we did undergo a joint northern saw-whet owl tagging project in 2021. We had 9 tags. Well, we had 10, but one didn't work, which is too bad because they're quite expensive. And Rocky Point had a whole bunch because they have a really big saw-whet program. And then Eric Demers out of VIU on the island also tagged some owls because we wanted to figure out where are all these coastal owls going. We had 4 detections. So Kamloops, Merritt, and Nanaimo, and then 1 at our tower in the valley. So the bird left, I think it was the 4th of September or the 5th of September in 2021, and then no sign of that owl on any towers, and then exactly a year later it showed up in the valley again. So who knows where it went. These other ones are funny because Nanaimo, it might have taken the same route as the ones that get captured at Rocky Point, and then Kamloops and Merritt, they just went totally different directions. So again, it's a lot of you can go onto the Motus website and you can see these movements, and when you look at the saw-whet owl projects, it looks like spaghetti kind of, just like they just go out in all these different directions. So it's hard to say whether it's a true migration. It's their own special type of migration. And then that's my coworker Avery, who grew up in the Kootenays, now lives in Whitehorse, and he's dealing with the guts, we're trying to download data and make it all work, and it's always a challenge, sometimes a little wire comes loose and then you're not collecting data. It takes you, a whole day just to get up there. It's fun. So there's a saw-whet with a tag. So that's what a Motus tag looks like. And that's the antenna coming off the back. You put on this leg loop harness, material that will wear off within a year, so just fall off, and the battery to the Motus tag actually dies after a year or 2. So it's minimally invasive. You're still putting something on an animal, but just to get the permits to put these on owls, you have to undergo quite a rigorous ethics review, which is important, always important. Okay, so we're going to switch over to molt. We're not going to get too in deep because it gets crazy. So we do have volunteers, and they usually come to us with no knowledge. And so trying to impart molt to them is always fun. So this is my attempt to make them laugh enough that they paid attention. I don't know if it worked, but they certainly enjoyed my picture with all of the different parts of the bird, terminology. A lot of people are really afraid of molt, partly because there's a few different systems. It's slowly becoming more centralized, the terminology, but it's so important. These birds travel such a long distance, and it's such a fraught journey, and in order to make that journey, they have to molt out fresh feathers. And so energy intensive and resource rich. They use a lot of resources, especially the adults. I mean, you see those breeders, and they look really nice, and that's because a lot of them, they're fairly fresh feathers. Now, there's been enough study. There's a biologist named Peter Pyle who, I don't know, crazy enough to undertake this study in North America, because when he started, there was no, we call it the Bible, but there was no book that told you all the nuances of each species. And so he undertook this years ago and published the first edition in '99, and there's been nothing until this year. He revised it completely after, 24 years, 25 years? And it's pretty amazing. We've learned a lot, but it's big. I actually meant to bring it, and I forgot it, but it covers 395 species and up to 857 subspecies, so it's comprehensive. It's pretty wild. Without that, my job would be really challenging, because you get some new species, oh dear, I have an idea of what kind of molt they undergo, but I got to figure it out. So there's these different predictable sequences that happen in particular species. Woodpeckers and owls are different. Owls undergo an eccentric molt, which is quite a bit different than a complete molt that adult passerines undergo, or the hatcheries undergo a partial, and then there's some species that undergo an incomplete molt, so it starts to your brain starts to hurt after a while. But it is really exciting. So here's a kind of a nice shot of a pine siskin's wing. So this is what we're looking at when we're trying to age birds. You're looking at the quality of the feathers and the wear, which again becomes quite challenging. There's always a bird that stumps you, and the project up in Fort McMurray that I worked on, Peter Pyle, the guru of molt, was a resource, and I'd send him pictures, or we'd send him pictures, and there are times when he says, yeah, I don't know. we can't age it. And you do, really? So it's, yeah. I think that's why a lot of people like birds. They keep you humble, both in the field and in the hand. There's always one that just blows your mind. You can see the fresh feathers, so the dark feathers. These are from last year, and this one's molting out, so these primaries are fresh. And then the primary coverts are these little ones above the primaries. And you can see the dark ones, those are also fresh, so those have just been molted out and they're working their way out. So the primaries are molted out distally, and then the secondaries are going towards the body. And then the tertials, that nice dark one on the inside, that's fresh. And then these greater coverts are fresh. So what you're doing is you're assessing the difference between the two. If you assess these as juvenile feathers, so molted out just after it got out of the nest, then this would be a second year. But in this case, pine siskins are tough, and especially as a female, because when they're in nest, they wear out their primaries a little bit more, because those are projecting down, same with the tail feathers. But these are actually adult feathers. The barbules are quite tight, and they're not as worn as you'd expect for hatchier, for juvenile feathers. And you're looking at like quality, color, glossiness. So the feathers that a young bird would call a hatchier, so born that year, they molt them all out at once, whereas an adult is sequentially so that they can still fly. And the quality is quite considerably less. So they don't invest a ton in that first set of flight feathers that they have, even though they keep them until the following year. They do their migration with them. And so they get really trashed, is the word. They're beat up, there's lots of, nicks and everything, whereas an adult has really lustrous, beautiful feathers. Tails are the same. Adult tails and feathers as a whole are quite broad, and hatchier feathers are quite spindly, sharp, Sometimes it's like a butter knife versus a steak knife, or, there's lots of different things. So it's hard to see, but once you see enough, there's an after hatchier feather. It's quite broad. It has a lot more on the outside of the vein, and then this one looks just kind of like this weird, sharp little thing. So this is how with the MAPS program, that's how you're differentiating the second years versus the after second years, and then you can infer habitat quality. And it's a whole study unto itself. It's a lot of fun, but it can be very humbling. And then kind of the last piece of all of this, which I think if you're doing any conservation work, is education and advocacy, right? It's really important. So we have a volunteer training program. A lot of bird observatories like Long Point actually rely on volunteers to run, so they get volunteers who are skilled and already trained. They have a few that they do train. Because of their funding, they only have a few paid staff, and then because their volume is super huge, so a big day at TLBO would be 100 birds. A big day at Long Point can be 500 birds, and you have one net open. We have all our 12 nets open, so it's a whole different beast. So what we try to do, and what we try to offer, is an opportunity for a couple people or a person to come up and volunteer who wants to learn these skills, because it's kind of like a trade. And every year we have, maybe we try to get people to come for a month. Most people only come for a week because it's like a language. It takes a while to learn, and immersion is the best. Because if you go away for another year, you come back and you've forgotten everything, right? So that's a kind of a unique part of our system. We don't require volunteers to run, unlike almost every other bird observatory. And then school groups. I said we're in a really remote part of the world. We are. There is a local school which is 40 kilometers away, and it's small. 16 kids, a principal and a teacher. Sometimes they have 20, and they come every year, which is really great.
And a bus driver.
Yeah, and a bus driver, exactly. Yeah, all of you have seen Kids with Wildlife. It's pretty fabulous when they see a beautiful bird in the hand, or we caught a harrier one time for them, kestrel. Those are life-changing experiences. Sometimes there's some schools that have high school students as well on some of the local reserves that have come, and it's also fun to see teenagers because they're in that stage where it really matters what their peers think. And so we had a saw-whet roosting one time, and we trained the scope on it far away, and we got them to look, and the kid would kind of like pretend like they wanted to see if it was cool, and they were like, oh, it's not cool. And then they look and they have this moment of, oh my And then they've like stopped themselves. It's not that cool. I go, okay, give them a few years and they'll get over it. But yeah, we really want to educate people, and we really try to do as much outreach as possible, even though we're working every day, which is a challenge because you don't have a lot of time. And then we have members of the Valley, locals who come every year. They drop by, we show them around. We have random people come by who have no idea what's going on, and we show them around, and we often, I think, kind of change their perspective, which is really valuable. And people come to both programs. There's a family that comes to the Saw-Whet program, and one girl comes and has a birthday party with her 3 friends every year. They love to see the Saw-Whets, which I don't blame them.
Yeah.
They're sweet little things that will destroy your hands. And then, of course, yeah, we're just trying to foster as much appreciation for nature that we can in the younger generation. Older, it doesn't matter. Anyone who will listen. Because hopefully that's the way that we can improve what's going on in the world. And I have no idea how long that took. I feel like I rambled, but that's it.
Very good.
Yeah, thank you. Now, I guess, I don't know if we have time. Do you guys have questions? I know I gave this presentation and everything went late, and it was like 9:30, and all of us were ready to crash, and no one wanted to ask any questions, which was great, because I really want to go to bed, but I feel like it's not. Yeah. But if you have questions, I'll attempt to ask them. If not, that's perfectly fine by me.
Sachi, I remember when I was a boy, I've been birding a long time.
Yeah.
I made friends with a boy who was friendly with birders. And he used to go out and do banding or ringing.
Yeah, ringing, exactly.
And I would go out and help him. And we got to do it by ourselves, no training, just go out and catch them.
Yeah.
And I remember going out with a butterfly net and trying to catch barn swallows, coming out the hole on this ladder. I never caught one.
Yeah.
It was so fast, and I turned around and
Yeah,
this guy's still birding now, he's 80, and after he retired, he had to go back to train for 5 years before he was allowed to do anything. Right?
well, in the UK, the training is even more rigorous to get your license than it is in Canada. Yeah. I mean, it's like everything. In the old days, there were a lot less rules. Fortunately, I think it's become a little more rigorous, and yeah, because there's a little more supervision.
Good thing.
Yeah, it is a good thing.
This is 16-year-old boy going out and do it.
Yeah, and there's certain points where people's hands don't function as well, and it's a hard moment when you have to, like there's a guy who would come up every year who was a big part of the observatory, and he was at the point where he shouldn't be handling birds anymore, but he just desperately wanted to, and it's a hard one to be like, I'm sorry, you care about these birds, the safety of these birds is literally in your hands, and so we had to kind of cut him off and give him other duties, which at first it was a distraction, and then after that I think he eventually just realized it was time. Yeah, because it's a very dexterous process. You can imagine, I don't know if any of you tie flies, taking a bird out of a mist net with all those feathers. It's a very, and so training people is challenging, right? Because you have to kind of show them enough times and then feel comfortable that it's an easy enough bird, and sometimes you got to get in there and stop them, and yeah, because again, it's a privilege to handle wildlife, but you also have to be very, very careful, and yeah, and it's tough. You have predation events, like there are raptors, you see a bird in the net, and every once in a while they get there before you. It doesn't happen often. At some places where I worked up in the Boreal, they had a major problem, and I never experienced this in my life, of bears nabbing birds out of nets. You'd come and there'd just be a hole. So that's when, again, you have to assess, because you have to report everything. And the bird banding office would be like, okay, well, why do you have so many casualties? What's going on? What are you changing? Because if you're not changing things, then we revoke your permit, and you can't, your research project is done. So yeah, there's a lot of it's like anything. You've got to constantly assess what you can do better and how you can do best by your study species or groups in this case. But yeah, yes.
I was wondering about the fires and how it affects what you're doing, what we're growing before or after.
After, that's a really cool question. So the project that I worked on, they had started 5 years before the fire, and so they had some data pre-fire, and they used the same sites every year. And post-fire, it totally changed. Different species, it took multiple years for things to regrow, and then some of the same birds that banded pre-fire showed up again once the habitat changed again. But also different birds used that habitat before that. They also had some interesting species like brewer sparrow showed up in multiple locations checking it out, and suddenly with the fire, the habitat looked a little more suitable. They also, when they started, are you guys familiar with Tennessee warblers and how they feed on spruce budworm? And so they have these peaks, they follow the spruce budworm around. So you have these kind of invasions of Tennessee warblers, and when they breed like crazy. So when they started, there were tons of Tennessee warblers, and I guess with the fires, there's other observatories that, I mean, they do other owls, depending where you are, they do boreal owls, they capture short-eared, long-eared, and then there's one that they catch some great horned, which is a nightmare. I have nightmares about that, coming and having a great horned in my sawwet net, because their crushing, pounds per square inch crushing strength is such that they could crush the bones in your hand if they get a hold, as they grab, prey's head. And so dealing with a bird that size that could, change my life is a little terrifying. But yeah, I would say that overall it's quick. We do it as quickly as possible, as efficiently as possible, and they're pretty much, they all seem to be okay. Yeah, because we get repeats. I mean, we get some song sparrows that we catch like 4 times a day. Yeah, because you band it, and then once you catch it again, you just let it go. And if there's ever any issues, we err on the side of caution. We just release the bird. Yeah, there's no point in getting the data if it's going to impact that bird's life. Because the best thing for us too, not only ethically, is that bird to survive, right? That's how we actually get some interesting data. But yeah, funny enough, chickadees are the meanest. If a black-capped chickadee was bigger, it would probably try to kill you. Yeah, they've got a lot of personality, and they're cavity nesters, so their legs are really strong. So that's the other thing. You have this bird in a bag, and you have to put your hand in and grab it without looking and not letting it out. And a chickadee's ready, and it's at the top. As soon as you open it, if you're not ready, like a volunteer, just chickadee's gone. Merlins are also very fierce too, as you would imagine. But yeah, the big ones like a harrier, it's pretty calm. Yeah, they're even shutting off. Pretty calm. They just kind of look at you. And I'm sure they're trying to figure out what on earth. The sawwets are
Want to start eating you?
Yeah, they're each one is different with the sawwets. Most of them just hang out, and some of them they hang out and they look at you and they're like, oh, everything's okay. And then they just, and their claws go under your fingernail and they hold on, and you just have to, to bear everything. It's that's the other thing. Is, when you're taking a bird out of the net, doesn't matter if there's bugs or anything, you have to just focus on what you're doing and just deal with everything. If a grosbeak bites your finger, you just have to suck it up and move on, and it hurts. It's like a vice grip.